Hi, Year 12. I hope you had a nice weekend. First of all, thank you to those of you who have sent me your work on the Via Negativa, which is the first type of religious language that we started with last week. Today I've got a double lesson for you. So I've got this video where I'll be going through a PowerPoint, but I'm also attaching some sheets. So if you could just make sure, first of all, please, that you've got these either saved to your computer or printed out to go through. And so they are. So you should have this sheet, which is really useful. And if you can, I would recommend that you print that out, highlight it as we're going through the lesson, and keep it in your folder. That's one that I will definitely print out for you at a later date if you haven't got printer ink or something. So that is one sheet that I'm attaching to today's lesson. And this is the other sheet, Ian Ramsey's Theories of Analogies. So you should have that sheet as well. As those two things, I am also attaching some pictures of 3 pages from the textbook, 4 pages, so page 48 to page 51, 53, so just 3 pages of the textbook today. And yeah, let's make a start. Okay, so last lesson we started this whole topic with something called the apophatic way. And the apophatic way is a way of talking about God or theology using negative terms, so by only saying what God isn't. And we also call that the via negativa. Today we are going to start looking at some of the opposite view. So to say that we need to use something called the cataphatic way, or the via positiva. And one way that we're going to look at today is doing that through analogical language. And then next lesson we'll talk about symbolic language. We need to know today what we mean by cataphatic way, and we need to learn about Aquinas' analogy of attribution and proposition. But we'll look at a few other things to extend that as well. So there's quite a lot of keywords today, and you can find them on the page from the book that I sent you last time, because it's keywords at the beginning of this chapter. But the ones that specifically relate to today's lesson are cataphatic way, which is a range of ways of, I should say, speaking about God and theological ideas using only terms that say what God is. So it is the opposite of the apophatic way. We'll be talking about analogy, and hopefully you know analogy is a comparison made between one thing and another in an effort to aid understanding. And we'll also be talking about something called anthropomorphism, which might be something you talk about in English language or something before, which is, in our case today, it's conception of God as having form, personality or attributes of a man. So last lesson we looked at words like king or warrior, and those are words that anthropomorphize God because they give God images or names that we often associate with men. So can you write down those key terms and definitions in your notes, please? Okay. So what do we mean by analogy? I'm sure that's a word you're already familiar with because a lot in the English language, but there are some things that we need to learn today that are about how analogy relates to religious language in particular. So we use analogy in everyday speech to describe something that is unfamiliar to us by making a comparison with something that we already know. And of course, we started philosophy this year with the allegory of the cave, which is full of analogies that Plato used to describe the way he felt the world. So when we say things like her face was like thunder, or we could even say her face was thunder, we're communicating something about her anger or her moodiness or her frustration. We could picture her face. You don't mean it's literally like thunder. So analogies are helpful, but they are helpful to a point. And so when we're doing religious language, we talk about them in different ways. So they are only an option, they're the only option available given the difficulty of making univocal or equivocal statements about God, and I'll unpack that a little. So these are some other key terms that you'll need to write down, please. And again, these aren't always specifically to do with religious language. So when we use univocal words or univocal terms, we're talking about a term that only has one meaning. In all contexts, it means the same thing. So that is, it signifies only one thought and therefore corresponds with only one definition. And these are words which mean the same even when applied to different contexts. So for example, the word black, we talk about black shoes, black hair, black car, it always means the same thing. Equivocal language is a word or a term that has a variety of different meanings. So it's got completely different intentions once it's used, and in different contexts it means different things. So for example, we might use the term bat, and we could be talking about a cricket bat or a flying bat. And again, the word good, we could say means different things to different people, and we use them in different ways. So I'd also like you please to write those key terms down with some examples as well, like I have. Okay, so the main philosopher for this topic is Thomas Aquinas, and he really moved away from the Via Negativa and talking about God only in negative terms. He said that we had to find ways of talking about God meaningfully, and by saying what God is, not just what God isn't. But he did say that it seems no word can be used literally of God, and so Aquinas proposed that we used analogy instead to talk about what God is. He said that there are two types of analogy, the analogy of attribution and the analogy of proportion. So first of all, I would suggest that you read page 51 yourself and read a little bit about Thomas Aquinas' view. And then, go on to the next thing that he said. So Aquinas rejects the negative use of language to describe God. He says that when believers say things like the living God, they mean more than to say God is not dead, and that's why the Via Negativa is not enough. We need to say things positively. And he argued that language means something concrete when applied to God, so it can mean something real. We can really be talking meaningfully about God using human language. So he approaches religious language in a very different way from the verificationists, which we'll come to later in the year. And he said that religious language is meaningful. He rejected the Via Negativa, partly as it doesn't say enough about what God actually is. And he focuses on the use of analogy for religious language. So there is a sheet on Aquinas' view, kind of mind map, and I'd like you to go through that, please. Highlight anything you think is really useful, and that can go in your folders. So, to summarize Aquinas' view, religious language is meaningful. He adapts the Via Negativa because it doesn't tell us what God actually is, and these are what he means by the analogy of attribution and the analogy of proportion. So, analogy of attribution tells us about the qualities of a particular thing and the causal relationship between God and the Creator. So you can read a little bit more about that on page 52, what we mean by the analogy of attribution. And secondly, the analogy of proportion tells us to the extent to which a thing corresponds to what it should be. And that shows us the different capacities between God and humans. And again, there's more information on that in page 52 to 53. So what I'd like you to do next, please, is to create this table. And then we've got on the one side phrases applied to God, and we looked at some of them last time. Actually, I don't think I gave you any of these for your task. So other words that are used to describe God, a shepherd, a rock, good, love, and a personal being. So what I'd like you to look at then is how that could be used in different ways. So the ways the analogy is valid when the phrase is applied to God. So in what ways could a shepherd be a good analogy for God? So we might say, well, a shepherd cares for the sheep, so that's an analogy between God and people that follow him. But what are the reasons the analogy shouldn't be pursued literally? I don't know, a shepherd, lived on the hills. Does God live on the hills? I don't know. Like, what are the reasons why it's not a useful thing? For a start, it just describes a human, doesn't it? So that's not a good enough word to use that on its own. It can't be used literally. So that should take you another 10 minutes or so to complete that table. And then what I'd like you to do is read the notes on John Hick on page 53, who talks about the analogy of proportionality there. And then there's a useful bit there where he kind of gives some examples of how we use language in that way. So then we move on to Ian Ramsey and his work on models and qualifiers. And this is a kind of an addition to Aquinas' idea of analogy. He goes a step further and says we can't just use analogies, we have to have models and qualifiers as well. So if you read the notes on page 53, there's just one paragraph on Ian Ramsey's work. And to summarise that, Ian Ramsey developed the theory of analogy in the 20th century, so he's a much more modern approach to religious language. And he came up with these ideas of models and qualifiers. So what he means by a model is an analogy to help us express something about God. So the word good could be a model in this way of doing things. So I could say God is good, and good, the word good there is the model. So we have a human understanding of the word good, and when it's applied to God, it's a model for understanding God's goodness. But Ian Ramsey said that if we want to understand God's goodness, then we need to adjust the model. We need to qualify it. So what we need to do is realize that it's not literally what God is like. So, for example, if we used God is good, we need to qualify that God is infinitely good, because then we're saying God is not good in the way that any human is good. God is infinitely good. This will make us think of God's goodness in a greater depth until we eventually have an insight into God's goodness. And we will respond to this insight with awe and wonder. So it's about saying, well, no, we can't compare God's goodness to a human's goodness, or God's love to a human love. So I thought you could have a go at coming up with some of these yourself, and that paragraph on page 53 might help you. But I've used the model good and added the qualifier infinitely. So have a go. I want you to try and come up with at least 3 other things. So the model would be the word that you could use to describe God. So you could use like things like powerful or knowing, but you need a qualifier that shows that it's different to how we might use that word in a human understanding. And then when you've done that, you've also got the sheet on Ian Ramsey's idea of models and qualifiers, and I'd like you to fill that in with one of your examples, please.